Welcome to Lore of the Ring, where we uncover the hidden roads of Middle-earth and tell the tales that Tolkien never wrote. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. Tonight, we follow one such path, a world where Smaug's fire did not die in Lake Town, and where the Dark Lord might have found a dragon at his side. In the dying light of autumn, as the winds of Lake Town carried ash and ember across the darkening waters, a single black arrow found its mark. The great dragon Smaug, chiefest and greatest of calamities, plummeted from the sky like a falling star, his golden belly pierced, his fire forever quenched. The people of Esgaroth cheered as the tyrant's body crashed into the lake, sending waves across the shore. Bard the bowman had done what none thought possible. He had slain the last of the great fire drakes of the north. But what if that arrow had missed its mark by mere inches? What if the dragon's thick hide had turned the blade, or the wind had carried it astray? What if, instead of falling like thunder into the lake, Smaug had wheeled in the air, roaring his terrible rage, and turned his eyes southward toward darker realms and greater ambitions? Picture, if you will, the shadow of great wings passing over the lonely mountain as the dragon abandons his stolen hoard. No longer content to sleep upon gold in the desolation of his making, Smaug seeks new conquests, new realms to burn and rule. His serpentine form cuts through the night sky like a blade of fire, and where his shadow falls, hope dies. For if Smaug lived beyond that fateful night, if death had not claimed him in the waters of the lake, then all of Middle-earth might have trembled beneath a darkness far more terrible than any yet imagined. If Smaug survived to meet the rising shadow of Sauron, could Middle-earth itself have endured such a convergence of malice and flame? To understand the catastrophe that might have unfolded, we must first comprehend what Smaug truly was. Not merely a dragon, but a living remnant of the elder days when shadow and flame first scarred the world. In the deep halls of memory, where the eldest tales are kept, dragons are remembered as the children of malice itself. Glaurung the Golden, father of dragons, who brought ruin to the hidden kingdom of Nargothrond. Ancalagon the Black, whose wings could blot out the sun, and whose fall shattered the towers of Thangorodrim. These were the Uraloki, the fire drakes of Morgoth, bred in the pits of Angband to be weapons of despair. Smaug was among the last of this terrible lineage, perhaps the very last of the great winged dragons of the north. When he came out of the waste and descended upon the lonely mountain like a hurricane of fire, he did not merely conquer, he transformed. The thriving kingdom of Dale became a wasteland. The halls of Erebor, where dwarven voices once rang with song and hammer strike, fell silent save for the dragon's breathing. For 60 years, Smaug slept upon his bed of stolen gold, and Middle-earth forgot what it meant to fear the wings of dragons. But by the time of the War of the Ring, when Sauron's power had grown mighty in Mordor and his shadow stretched across the lands, the dragons were thought to be no more. The Dark Lord gathered armies of orcs and men. He summoned the Nazgûl from their dwelling places. He raised the towers of Barad-dûr higher and darker than ever before. Yet nowhere in his vast host was there a dragon, for dragons, it seemed, had passed out of the world with the ending of the elder days. In his letters, Tolkien himself pondered this absence, writing to his son Christopher that if Smaug had lived to see the War of the Ring, the result would have been much more terrible for the good side. The professor understood what many readers overlook, that dragons were not mere beasts, but creatures of intelligence, cunning, and malice that could shift the very balance of power in Middle-earth. Smaug alive would have been a wild card in the great game between light and shadow, a force that could tip the scales toward absolute darkness. As Sauron's influence spread from the Tower of Dol Guldur and the Black Gate opened to disgorge his armies, imagine the world's terror if dragon wings had once again darkened the sky. The Free Peoples had prepared for war against orcs and men, against the 9 servants of the Ring and the sorcery of the Dark Lord. But who among them remembered how to fight dragons? Who could stand against the marriage of ancient malice and living flame? In the black years when Sauron's power waxed strongest, when his will reached out from Mordor to bend all things to his purpose, a meeting between the Dark Lord and the last great dragon would have been inevitable. But what form would such an encounter take? Would Sauron, master of domination and deceit, seek to bind Smaug to his will as he had the 9 kings? Or would the dragon's pride and ancient malice prove too great even for the Lord of the Ring to master? Picture the scene. In the depths of Mount Doom, where the fires of the earth burn eternal, 2 titans of darkness regard each other across a chasm of flame. Sauron, cloaked in shadow and malice, his presence a weight that crushes the spirit. Smaug, magnificent and terrible, his scales gleaming like molten gold, his eyes twin furnaces of greed and wrath. Each recognizes in the other a power that could reshape the world, and each knows that such power cannot be shared. Sauron's strength lies in domination, in the bending of wills to his purpose. Through word and ring, through fear and dark sorcery, he has made servants of kings and nations. Even the mightiest have fallen to his persuasion. Saruman the White, once chief of the wizards, became his puppet through pride and the promise of power. The 9 kings, greatest of mortal men, were reduced to wraiths in service to his will. Surely, the Dark Lord would reason, one dragon, however mighty, could be brought to heel. Yet dragons are not men, and their malice runs deeper than mortal ambition. Glaurung the Golden served Morgoth, yes, but as a weapon serves its wielder. Terrible in purpose, but requiring a master's hand to direct its fury. The great dragons of the elder days were bound to the Dark Lord Morgoth, not through rings of power or promises of dominion, but through the very circumstances of their creation. They were bred in the furnaces of Angband, shaped by malice into living instruments of war. Smaug, however, was born wild in the wastes of the north, claiming his power through conquest rather than gift. Would the One Ring's dominion extend even to dragonkind? In the depths of his greed, would Smaug prove vulnerable to the same temptations that had corrupted kings and wizards? Or would his pride, vast as his hoard and burning like the fires in his belly, prove an insurmountable barrier to the Dark Lord's will? The dragon's voice would echo through the chambers of Mount Doom like distant thunder. You offer me service, Sauron of Mordor, but I am not some petty king to be crowned with your gifts. I am Smaug the Mighty, last of the fire drakes. I have slept upon beds of gold while kingdoms rose and fell. What can you offer that I have not already taken by right of strength? And in that moment of defiance, both would recognize the truth, that Middle-earth was not large enough for 2 lords of such terrible ambition. The question would no longer be alliance, but which of them would ultimately rule over the ashes of the world. If Smaug refused Sauron's dominion, if the dragon's pride proved greater than his wisdom, then the north would have burned with a fire more terrible than any war. Consider the geography of power in those dark days. Sauron's strength was centered in Mordor, his armies poised to strike at Gondor and Rohan from the south and east. But with Smaug alive and hostile, a new front would open across all the northern lands, and this one would be beyond even the Dark Lord's direct control. The dragon would not need armies or siege engines to devastate the realms of the Free Peoples. From his lair in the lonely mountain, Smaug could strike at will across vast distances. Dale, rebuilt by Bard and his descendants, would become a pyre, visible from the misty mountains. The halls of Erebor, recently reclaimed by Thorin's company, would echo once more with dragonfire instead of dwarven song. The woodland realm of Thranduil, safe in its halls of starlight and tree song, would see its mighty boughs reduced to ash and ember. But the destruction would not end there. With each conquest, Smaug's power would grow and his ambition with it. The dragon might turn his terrible gaze upon Esgaroth once more, reducing the lake town to splinters and steam. He could sweep westward to burn the fields of the Shire, delighting in the terror of those peaceful folk who had never known war. Even Rivendell, hidden valley of the elves, might not escape his notice. And what songs would survive if the last homely house were consumed in dragonfire? Without Bard's victory at Lake Town, the Battle of Five Armies would never occur. Thorin and his company would remain dispossessed wanderers. The dwarves of Erebor would never reclaim their ancient strength, and the men of Dale would cower in the shadow of the dragon's wing. The entire balance of power in the north would shift, leaving the free peoples fractured and leaderless, just as Sauron's forces marshaled for their greatest assault. Worse still, Sauron would no longer need to divide his attention. In the true timeline, the Dark Lord was forced to garrison the north against the restored kingdoms of Dale and Erebor, to send armies to besiege the Lonely Mountain and prevent the dwarves and men from marching south to aid Gondor. But with Smaug rampaging through the northern lands, Sauron could concentrate his full might against Minas Tirith and the Pelennor fields. Gondor would face not just the armies of Mordor, but the undivided malice of the Dark Lord's will. Imagine Gandalf's horror as he realized the scope of the catastrophe. The White Wizard had long feared that Smaug might ally with Sauron, telling Thorin's company that such a partnership would spell doom for all the free peoples. But Smaug as an independent force of destruction might prove even worse, for chaos is harder to predict and counter than calculated evil. Where Sauron's armies could be met in battle, where his strategies could be divined and countered, the dragon's wrath would fall like lightning from a clear sky, unpredictable and unstoppable. The great halls of Khazad-dûm, already fallen to shadow and flame in the depths, might echo with dragon roar as Smaug claimed the ancient dwarven realm for his own. The misty mountains themselves could become a barrier of fire and fear, cutting the western lands off from any aid from Lothlorien or the southern kingdoms. In this dark timeline, the Fellowship of the Ring would begin their quest not just against the growing shadow of Mordor, but beneath the very real too. Threat of dragon wings overhead and dragonfire below. Yet perhaps the most terrifying possibility would be Smaug's relationship with the One Ring itself. In the depths of his greed, surrounded by gold and jewels beyond counting, how would the dragon react to the knowledge that somewhere in Middle-earth lay a treasure beyond all others, a ring of power that could grant dominion over all living things? Dragons and rings of power share an ancient and terrible connection. Tolkien wrote that dragons were drawn to such treasures with an almost magnetic compulsion, their greed for precious things extending beyond mere gold to encompass artifacts of true power. Smaug had already demonstrated this obsession, knowing his hoard so intimately that he could detect the theft of a single cup. But the One Ring was not merely precious. It was the masterwork of the enemy, wrought with malice and dominion, a thing that could corrupt the mightiest of beings. Would the ring's influence extend to dragonkind? Could Smaug, in his pride and greed, prove vulnerable to its promises of power? Or would his nature as a creature of fire and ancient malice make him resistant to its corruption, even as it made him desire it beyond all reason? Imagine the dragon learning of the ring's existence, perhaps through captured prisoners or the whispers of his spies among the crows and ravens. His great eye would kindle with a light more terrible than molten gold, and his voice would shake the very foundations of the Lonely Mountain. A ring of power, you say? A treasure beyond all treasures, hidden from Smaug the Mighty? The thought would consume him as surely as fire consumes parchment. But here lies the most chilling possibility of all. What if Smaug succeeded in claiming the ring for himself? A ring-bearer dragon would be a force beyond imagining, combining the ancient malice and physical might of dragonkind with the dominating will of Sauron's masterwork. Such a creature would be nearly invincible, capable of bending entire nations to its will with a word, of commanding armies through fear and force of personality alone. The corruption would be absolute and terrible. Where Sauron wielded the ring with calculated malice, seeking order through domination, Smaug would use it to satisfy his boundless greed and pride. Middle-earth would become not an ordered realm under a Dark Lord's rule, but a wasteland where a dragon king held court over a throne of skulls and gold. The free peoples would be reduced to cattle, existing only to gather tribute for their terrible master. Yet perhaps the ring would prove Smaug's undoing, as it had so many others. Dragons, for all their cunning, are creatures of appetite and impulse. The ring's corruption might twist Smaug's already vast pride into something approaching madness, leading him to challenge not just mortal kingdoms, but the very Valar themselves. In his hubris, the dragon might seek to claim not just Middle-earth, but the undying lands beyond the sea, bringing him into conflict with powers that even Sauron dared not face directly. There is another possibility, more subtle but perhaps more dangerous still, that Smaug would seek the ring not to wield it, but to deny it to Sauron. In the dragon's calculating mind, the ring would represent the Dark Lord's path to ultimate victory. By claiming it for himself, Smaug would not merely gain power, but would strip his rival of the weapon needed to complete his conquest. The dragon would become not Sauron's servant or ally, but his greatest and most dangerous enemy. Picture the confrontation that would inevitably follow. Sauron, stripped of his ring but still mighty in sorcery and will, leading the hosts of Mordor north against the lonely mountain. Smaug, wreathed in the ring's power and his own terrible fire, rising to meet them in a battle that would reshape the very landscape of Middle-earth. The war would be not between light and shadow, but between two aspects of darkness so mighty that their conflict might well destroy the world they sought to rule. Yet even in this darkest of timelines, hope might endure in the most unexpected places. The free peoples of Middle-earth had faced dragons before and survived. They had stood against the might of Morgoth himself in the Elder Days and lived to tell the tale. If Smaug lived to threaten the world, then surely the wise and the brave would find ways to resist him, just as they had always found ways to stand against the darkness. Gandalf the Grey, who had long foreseen the danger of Smaug allying with Sauron, would not be caught unprepared. The White Council, Gandalf, Saruman, Elrond, Galadriel, and others had already demonstrated their power in driving Sauron from Dol Guldur. Could they marshal that same strength against a dragon? The Istari were Maya, lesser angels sent from the west, and their power, when fully awakened, was considerable. Gandalf's confrontation with the Balrog in Moria proved that even ancient evils could be defeated by those who stood for the light. The eagles of the Misty Mountains, led by the mighty Gwaihir, had aided the free peoples many times throughout the ages. These great birds were no mere animals, but noble spirits in avian form, possessing intelligence and valor that had turned the tide of battle before. Could a host of eagles, led by their greatest warriors, challenge even Smaug in aerial combat? Their beaks and talons might not pierce dragonhide, but their speed and numbers could harry the great dragon, perhaps driving him back to his mountain fastness when he sought to range abroad. Beorn the Skin Changer, that mighty being who could take the form of a great bear, had already proven his worth in the Battle of 5 Armies in the true timeline. His people, scattered though they were, possessed an ancient hatred for dragons and orcs alike. In his bear form, Beorn was mighty enough to carve through armies of goblins. Might he and his kindred pose a threat even to Smaug? Their strength was legendary, their courage beyond question, and their knowledge of the wild lands could prove invaluable in any campaign against the dragon. Even the Ents, those ancient shepherds of the forest, might rouse themselves to war against such a threat. They had slept through much of the Third Age, tending their trees and caring little for the affairs of the younger races. But dragons were creatures of fire, and fire was the great enemy of all growing things. If Smaug began burning the great forests of Middle-earth, Fangorn, Mirkwood, the woods of Lothlorien, then even the slow-thinking Ents might be stirred to a wrath not seen since the Elder Days. The march of the Ents against Isengard had been terrible to behold. Their advance against a dragon's lair would be the stuff of legend. Yet perhaps the greatest hope would lie not in mighty warriors or ancient powers, but in the courage of simple folk. In the true timeline, it was Bard the Bowman, not a great king or wizard, but a common archer of Lake Town, who brought down the mighty Smaug. It was Bilbo Baggins, a humble hobbit who wanted nothing more than his comfortable hole and regular meals, who discovered the dragon's weakness and enabled his defeat. Throughout Middle-earth's history, it has been the small and seemingly insignificant who have accomplished the greatest deeds, the hobbits of the Shire, those peaceful folk who loved growing things and simple pleasures, might seem the least likely to stand against a dragon. Yet their courage, when roused, had already changed the course of history. Frodo and Sam's journey to destroy the ring proved that even the smallest person could make a difference. In a world threatened by dragonfire, perhaps another hobbit would step forward with the courage to face the impossible. The men of Gondor and Rohan, the elves of Rivendell and Lothlorien, the dwarves of the Blue Mountains and the Iron Hills, all would unite as they never had before, putting aside ancient grievances and petty politics in the face of extinction. The dragon would face not scattered kingdoms, but a true alliance of all free folk, their combined strength focused like a spear point against his terrible heart. And perhaps, in the end, that would be enough. Perhaps courage and hope and the simple refusal to surrender would prove stronger than fire and malice and ancient pride. It had happened before in Middle-earth's long history. It could happen again. But if alliance and resistance proved insufficient, if courage alone could not overcome the convergence of dragonfire and the Dark Lord's malice, then Middle-earth would witness a conflict unlike any in its long history, a war between titans that would shake the very foundations of the world. Imagine the inevitable confrontation between Smaug and Sauron, when pride and ambition could no longer be contained within the bounds of pretended cooperation. Two masters of malice, each convinced of their own supremacy, each unwilling to bow before the other. The dragon, ancient and cunning, confident in his strength and fire. The Dark Lord, subtle and terrible, wielding power that had brought kingdoms to their knees. The battle would not be fought with armies, though armies would die in its wake. It would be a contest of will against will, fire against shadow, the physical might of dragonkind against the spiritual dominion of the enemy. Mount Doom itself might crack under the strain, spilling lava across the plains of Mordor as the two powers clashed. The very air would burn with their hatred, and the ground would tremble beneath the weight of their fury. Smaug would come in his full, terrible glory, wings spread wide enough to darken the sky, fire streaming from his jaws like molten rivers. His roar would shatter stone and steel. His presence would be a furnace that turned sand to glass and melted armor like wax. But he would not come as he had to Lake Town, confident and contemptuous. This time he would face a foe who matched his malice and exceeded his cunning. Sauron would not meet the dragon in physical form, for his power lay in subtlety and dominion rather than brute strength. Instead, he would weave webs of shadow and terror, seeking to bind the dragon's will as he had bound so many others. The very darkness would become his weapon, reaching out with grasping tendrils to crush the life from his enemy. The eye of Sauron would fix upon Smaug with all its malice, and in that gaze would be the weight of dominion over all living things. Yet dragons are not easily dominated, and Smaug had grown in power and cunning during his long years in the north. His fire would burn away shadow, his will would resist domination, his ancient pride would prove an armor against fear. The contest would rage for days or weeks, with neither able to claim victory over the other, and in that stalemate, in that balance of malice and might, the world would burn. The armies of Mordor, caught between dragon and dark lord, would flee or be consumed. The settlements of men and elves would empty as refugees fled the devastation. Great cities would become funeral pyres, and the very shape of Middle-earth would change under the pressure of such terrible forces. Perhaps in the end, both would destroy each other, their mutual annihilation leaving Middle-earth scarred but free. Or perhaps one would emerge victorious, crowned King of Ashes over a world too broken to be worth ruling. Either way, the price would be beyond imagining, paid in blood and fire and the tears of all who loved the light. The greatest tragedy would be that this war between titans would accomplish what neither the dragon nor the Dark Lord could achieve alone: the complete destruction of everything beautiful and good in Middle-earth. In their hatred for each other, they would burn away hope itself, leaving nothing but wasteland and despair. Yet even then, even in the darkest hour when fire and shadow contended for dominion over the ruins of the world, there might be those who remembered what was worth saving. Hidden in deep places, guarded by courage and love, the seeds of new growth might wait for their chance to reach toward the light once more. In the end, as ash settles over the bones of a broken world, and the last fires die in the ruins of once great cities, we must ask ourselves what this dark vision truly teaches us. Tolkien understood that the world balances on a knife's edge, that small actions can have vast consequences, that the difference between hope and despair can rest upon something as simple as an arrow's flight. Bard's arrow, black-fletched and true, did more than pierce a dragon's heart. It preserved the very possibility of hope in Middle-earth. Without that single moment of courage and skill, without that one shaft finding its mark in the hollow of Smaug's throat, the entire tapestry of the Third Age would have unraveled into chaos and flame. The lesson echoes through Tolkien's works, like a bell tolling across still water, that in the great stories, it is not the mighty who save the world, but the small and seemingly insignificant. A hobbit carrying a ring, an archer with a black arrow, a gardener refusing to abandon his master. These are the turning points upon which history pivots, the moments when courage conquers despair and light overcomes darkness. If Smaug had lived, if the dragon had spread his wings over Middle-earth in alliance or rivalry with the Dark Lord, then the professor's great theme of the long defeat would have become something far more terrible, and short and absolute victory for the forces of shadow and flame. The careful balance between hope and despair that makes Tolkien's work so powerful would have collapsed into despair alone, leaving no room for the eucatastrophe, the sudden joyous turn that redeems all suffering. In our dark imagining, we see a world where dragons and dark lords contend for dominion over ash and bone, where the light of the Eldar fails and the songs of the Shire fall silent forever. It is a vision of endings without redemption, of defeat without the possibility of resurrection. Such a world would have no place for the Grey Havens, where ships sail west toward the undying lands. There would be no room for hope deferred but not destroyed, no space for the long consolation that follows even the greatest sorrows. Perhaps this is why Tolkien, consciously or unconsciously, ensured that Bard's arrow flew true. Perhaps his sub-creative instinct recognized that Middle-earth could not survive the convergence of such ancient malices, that the world he had built with such love and care require, at the dragon's death, to preserve its essential nature. Smaug's fall was not merely the defeat of a villain, but the preservation of hope itself. And so we return to that moment by the waters of Lake Town, when a single arrow changed the course of history. In the ripples spreading out from that splash, in the silence that followed the dragon's final roar, we find not just the death of a monster, but the birth of possibility. Because Smaug fell, Erebor could be reclaimed. Because the dragon died, the battle of 5 armies could unite the free peoples of the north. Because fire was quenched in the lake's cold waters, hope could survive to kindle new flames in the darkness yet to come. The dragon sleeps now beneath the waters, and Middle-earth endures. The long defeat continues, as it always has, balanced between sorrow and joy, loss and renewal, the dying of the light and its constant, miraculous return. In this balance, in this refusal to surrender to absolute darkness, we find the true magic of Tolkien's world, not in wizards or rings or dragons, but in the stubborn insistence that tomorrow might be better than today, that courage need not be rewarded to be worthwhile, that even in the longest defeat, victory remains possible. Perhaps that arrow, flying true through the autumn air, carries all our hopes with it. Perhaps in its flight, we glimpse something of what Tolkien called the light of Arundel's star, that far-off gleam of hope that no darkness can entirely extinguish. And perhaps that is enough. Dear listener, this story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.